So thank you for the question. That was exciting to see some questions. So let's go to the next part. I think that will help answer the question about publication. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of practices, and then I'll go more into the nitty-gritty of how you can work with data to help with replication. So I'm going to start. I'm going to talk about 4 different things that are happening now to help with replication and reproducibility. One is the reporting standards that are being used in different journals and different fields. This is changing, and again, in principle, should help us with reproducibility. Then I'll talk a little bit about replication, because this is something really important that we need to encourage. Then I'm going to talk about data sharing, because this is actually really an important part of replication as well. And then I'll talk about the reproducible workflow. Okay, so what are reporting standards? So these are just an explicit guideline about the information that researchers should present as part of their study. So at least in the social science, in the journals where I publish, there are some standards, but there's also a lot of things that are not said. So where the researcher can decide, what to present about the analysis or what to present about the data. There are some kind of advice, but it's not very clear what are the things that need to be presented. And because of that, there's no consistency, and also some researchers might not share some really important information about their studies. So a standard that was developed again in the health sciences, it's called the Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials. Again, this started somewhere in the mid-90s and now has almost universal adoption in the medical field. So CONSORT, which is just the short name for that, includes 8 different areas that need to be mentioned in the study. So the study context, the study design, details about the data collection, data description, analysis methods used, results, reporting, study limitations, and materials. And this can be very precise. So it could be, like a list that says exactly what are the things that need to be included. And there are some journals where you literally need to say what is the page where you fill out each of this information. Otherwise, you're not going to be even allowed to submit your article. So these categories are even more precise, so they can ask for response rates or what are cases that are excluded. And then you need to say specifically where in your manuscript you're describing these different decisions that were made. Okay, so this is really the kind of the main standard that is being used now in the medical field. And I think this also is having an impact in the social sciences. So in addition to the standards that the journal use, another important part is about using shared definitions or standardized definition for key concepts in our field. So a really good example of this is the response rates. So response rates in surveys, they can be defined in very different ways. And if you don't have any common definition or some principles about what should be reported, in principle, anyone can report whatever they want. So the American Association of Public Opinion Research has a document that clearly defines the different types of response rates that exist. And also their journals also has clear guidelines about what response rates should be published or should be part of your manuscript in order to get published. So these kind of shared definitions are really important because it makes sure that reviewers and researchers speak the same language, and then they are very easy to be implemented in standards that other journals can use to say, okay, these are things that we expect you to have in your article in order to get published. Sorry. Okay, sorry about that. I'm starting to lose my voice. Okay, so another type of standard that is being increasingly used in the social sciences for publication is also called TOP, coming from transparency and openness promotion. And what this has is basically, it has, again, different areas and different things that need to be reported in each article. And they have also 3 levels of kind of how strict they are. So the first one is this disclosure, where they recommend that the researchers should say something about each of these different areas I'm going to show you. The next level is requirements, saying that if you don't say these things about your research methods or the data, you can't get published. And then the strictest version is to have verification, where somebody actually goes through your code or goes, to the documentation of the data and checks that the things you say are correct. Okay, so these are the 3 levels. As you expect, having the 3rd level is actually very time consuming. So there are very few journals that would actually do verification on all of these different aspects. But most journals could probably do either level 1 or level 2. So an example of a journal, at least in my field, that moved to this is the Survey Research Methods Journal. So they, I think, either expect disclosure or they have a requirement for these different areas. So there are 8 areas. So first, citation standards. And this also includes citing data. And I'll come back to this idea of citing data because it can be really important for replication. But the idea is that you should cite all the sources and both, other articles that you have read and cite, but also the data that you use. Then you should have information about the analytical methods that you're going to use. And this includes sharing the code that you have used. Then you need to have information about the design and the analysis. So this is about the different statistical models that you're going to use and the way you're going to implement them. They also allow for the pre-registration of analysis. So if you want to go through this step where you publish your analysis plan in advance, again, the journals that adhere to TOP, they allow for you to do that as well. So you can give all the details of the analysis before you actually do it. Then there's also some expectation about data transparency. So the idea would be that you say what data you use by citing it, but also how people can access it, what version of the data you used, and so on. Then also sharing the materials for the data collection. So this could be, questionnaires or code books or other things that are relevant to the study. They also encourage pre-registration of studies. So this is registration before you actually collect the data. And again, they encourage people to publish these kind of things. And finally, they encourage replication. So they encourage studies that would replicate the work of other researchers. So going back to the question from Paul, it's like, okay, what can be done about this? So this kind of standards really is helping us move in that direction. And again, by having these expectations very clear, researchers know that they have to do some of these things. And I think most of these are done by the researchers. It's just they're not explicitly shared. So this is just a way to encourage us to do that. So another important aspect of all of this is replication. So this is the idea of seeing how reliable is the previous work, given all the issues we discussed, from specification search to publication bias, it's quite important from time to time to validate what other people have done to see if we can still find those results. And again, we need to encourage people to do this more, and partially we do that by changing the incentives and making it easier to publish and giving credit to the people that do that. So there are different kind of flavors of replication. So if you use exactly the same data and you follow exactly the same procedures that somebody else has done, this is called verification. So you do this if you just want to see if the code works. And while this sounds like, a pretty low threshold, even this sometimes is not met. So this is literally just, downloading the data, downloading the code that we used, and seeing if you just run the code, you get the same results. That's called verification. There are some journals that do this where they actually have someone trying to redo the analysis, but very few actually do that because it's very time consuming. And then if you want to use the same data, but you want to introduce some small differences, this is also called reanalysis. So you might want to do something like this, where a little bit like a sensitivity analysis, where you want to see, well, would we get the same results under slightly different conditions if we include different controls? It's a way to see if the findings are actually consistent and credible. Okay. So this is reanalysis. If you're going to use different data and you want to follow exactly the procedures, this is called direct replication. And the idea is that if you have new data, in principle, things like specification search shouldn't be an issue, because you have new data you never looked at and use exactly the procedures that somebody else used. So that would be a very good way to do confirmatory work that avoids specification search. And then if you use slightly different methods or models with different data, this is called an extension. And again, similar to reanalysis, the idea would be to see if the findings that were published before are we likely to get them in slightly different contexts. And again, it makes our theories more credible if they're more general and they are true under different conditions, under for different populations, with different control variables, different statistical models, and so on. So there are different versions of this depending on exactly what you want to do, if you use the same procedures or not, or if you use the same data or new data. And you can decide one of these depending on your kind of research question and aims. So one way to improve replicability is to do also something called replication audits. And the idea of a replication audit is that a team of researchers together, they try to replicate multiple papers that are important in a field. And typically this is very time consuming and difficult to do. So normally this is done in a large group. And sometimes you can also do like a crowdsourced replication, where you have a call and researchers from different parts of the world come together to try to replicate some findings. Another thing that is quite important, and this is links back to why the standards for publication are really important, is that if you want to change behavior, the best time to do it is before a paper is published. If you want to do anything afterward, it's much harder. Like if you try to find the code or the data once the article is published, it becomes increasingly difficult as more time passes. So let's talk a little bit about replication audits. So like I said, these are actually really hard to do, because the idea is to take some of the most important findings in a field and try to replicate them in different contexts by different teams. So only a few of these have been done, but they have very high impact. And I can give you an example from psychology called a project called Reproducible Project Psychology. So they looked at around 100 experiments from 3 top journals from 2008. And their aim was to collect the data and rerun the analysis and see if they find the same results or not. And what they found is that actually the majority of the study results could not be replicated. So this is very concerning for psychology as a science, and I think more generally for social science, that the top articles and experiments are not replicated. So you can look this up. Actually, this is quite a well-known project, so you can search for it and you'll see more details about what studies they try to replicate, what are the issues that they found, and so on. And other things like this have happened in different fields. Even I think in survey methodology, for example, they were trying to replicate some classical experiments to see if they are still replicated 30 years on, and so on. So there's a possibility that something like this might have happened in your own field as well. Crowdsourced replication is slightly different. So the idea would be that you want to take maybe, important study from your field or get some data that is really popular or important, and ask people to do their own analysis to answer a particular research question on their own. And the idea is that each researcher or each team will work in a slightly different way. They'll make different assumptions, they'll do a different type of model. And then the idea is to bring everything together and to see what are the results. And again, a little bit like the meta-analysis we see before, is to see, how consistent are the findings and how different decisions can impact the final results. And actually, there's a kind of a special type of report that comes out of this called a register replication report, where again, the idea would be to have this work pooled from multiple researchers and teams of researchers, and to see what are the systematic patterns in analyzing basically the same data and trying to answer the same research question. Going back to this point about intervention before initial publication, a lot of journals are kind of changing their procedures, and basically they're asking researchers to do more things in advance. And like I said, I think most of these things are done. It's just they tend not to be published or shared. So this includes publishing of data or of code. Some journals actually verify the code, like I said before. And there are some journals that actually ask researchers to do their own replication. So if, for example, they have a small experiment, they might ask them to run the experiment again, just to make sure that they find kind of consistent results. And again, doing this thing before publication really encourages researchers to take this on board. So in all this work for replication, an important aspect is data sharing. And there are two important reasons why we should ask researchers to share data. One is for evaluation. So it allows for verification and reanalysis, and also it increases trust. So the fact that this data actually exists out there somewhere and you can check it decreases the chances that this is not made up, although it's not a guarantee like we saw in some cases. And then it's also useful for generating new research. So the same data could be used to answer new and interesting research questions, and also they maximize the potential of the data. And this is really important for organizations that actually fund research. They want their data to, to be used by other researchers and to increase its utility. So while I think most of us agree that sharing data is useful and we should do it, there's also some reasons for reluctance. So one is that it undermines the incentives to collect data. So it's time consuming and difficult to collect data, to run experiments, and researchers arguably want to have a first chance to publish things from their hard work. And again, there are possible solutions to this, like embargoes, but this is a reason why researchers might be reluctant to share their data. They invested a lot of time and resources and they want to make the most of it, and they don't want someone else to use it before them. Another issue is data privacy. So if you think you have very sensitive data and could be used to identify individuals, you might not want to share the data. If something happens, then this might, decrease the credibility of your group or your institution. So some researchers might be reluctant to share the data because of that. And then it could be for computational reasons. So, if you have sensors that collect information about, I don't know, all the cars that go over a particular intersection in a city, and that creates 1 gigabyte of data every day, it might be hard to share some of the data that you used, because it can be very large and it's collected continuously. Again, I think there's more and more tools or possible solutions for this, but there are situations where, because of computational reasons, it might not be possible to share the data. So how can we encourage people to share the data? So one possible solution is to use extract sharing. So the idea here is to share only particular variables. So for example, if you use 5 variables in your analysis from your experiment, you only have to share those 5 variables, and you don't have to share other variables that you might use for other analysis. So this is useful for replication. So if I wanted to check if your code works, then I can use that data to do verification or replication. But this doesn't really help with specification search, because I don't know what are all the possible variables that you looked at. I don't know what are the different tests that you might have run. So it has limited utility for specification search. Another practice that is useful is to have data embargoes. And the idea is that there's a period of time where only the researchers that collect the data have access to it, and then it's publicly available. So for example, the German socioeconomic panel, they have a sample where they do experiments, the innovation sample, and they have a period of a year in which the researchers that ran a particular experiment can use the data and no one else will have access to it. And after that, the data becomes publicly available and anyone can use it. So that way people have a period where they have an advantage and they can use the data, but then afterwards the data has to be publicly available. And finally, by encouraging people to cite data, it actually also increases the incentives of people to share their data. So the number of citations is quite important for tenure and promotion and so on in academia. So by getting acknowledgement for the hard work of collecting data, then we can ensure or motivate people to share the data. And actually, this is also true about sharing code. So it's possible to get a DOI for a piece of code, for example, that you had in a paper, and people in principle can cite that piece of code afterwards, and you get some citation because of that. A similar practice happens with R packages, for example. People work a lot to create these packages, and the way they get credit is by citation. So by citing the packages that you use, you're actually supporting the people that develop them. The last reason why people might be reluctant to share the data is data privacy. And here it's useful to think of 2 different concepts. One is confidential data. And the idea here is that researchers have information about the identity of the participants, but agree not to share it. And then we have anonymous data, where researchers themselves don't know the respondent's identity. And typically, the agency that collects the data, or the group of researchers that collect the data, they would have confidential data because they need to contact the participants and get agreements and so on. But normally, anonymous data would be shared. And again, this is a way to avoid issues with identification of individuals, but still make the data useful. And there are a couple of solutions here. You can restrict the access to the data. So you can say only particular people can access the data, or you can only access it in a secure lab, for example, if this is really sensitive. And that way you kind of minimize the risk of identification. Again, there's a lot of work being done on anonymizing data and also on differential privacy. So ways in which we can, make the data useful to other researchers without making it possible for individuals to be identified. So this is an ongoing area of research. There's lots of research on privacy and anonymization. And again, because there's a lot of data that might be useful to other people, but also there's a very high risk of identifying individuals. There's a lot of ongoing ongoing work here. And again, places like data archives are experts in dealing with this kind of trade-off between having useful data and then protecting the privacy of participants. So if you want to share the data or if you want to access data shared by other people, where can you look? Well, there are a few big data archives out there. So there's one at the University of Michigan. There's one in UK at the University of Essex. There's also a European one called CESDAT, and most countries would have some kind of data archive, like GESIS in Germany, and most countries would have a data archive where people can register and have different levels of information depending on their needs and depending on the data. Other places are the Dataverse. So this is a website where people can share data and code. The Open Science Framework also allows for the sharing of data and code. And if the data is small, you can also share it using GitHub. So for example, the data from Johns Hopkins about the number of COVID cases is shared on GitHub. So you can go on GitHub and download daily rates of COVID infections for free online. And you can also link GitHub with other services like Zenodo to get a DOI. So in that way, people can cite your data. And most of these other services like the data archives and the Open Science Framework also allows for you to get a DOI and for people to cite the data once you make it publicly available, documents and so on. Okay, so next I want to talk a little bit about tools that you can use in your own research as an analyst to improve reproducibility. I'm going to focus kind of a little bit on R and RStudio because I know that best, but a lot of these concepts and principles, you can apply them if you use Python or use something else as well. I really like this quote that highlights an important thing that doesn't seem very obvious in the journals, at least in the social sciences. So it says, an article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself, it is merely advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is the complete software development environment and the complete set of instructions which generates the figures. Okay, so as we kind of move away and we use more data, we use more complicated statistical models, then we, what we do with the code becomes more and more important. And the actual paper that gets reviewed and published is becoming a smaller and smaller part of our jobs as analysts. So then what we do with the code becomes more important, and I want to talk a little bit about that. So if we want to do transparent work and help with this work of reproducibility, we need to change some of the ways in which we work, and we should have some workflows and use software that help reproducibility. And I'm going to discuss some of these things that are relatively easy to implement. Some of them you already might be doing, and some might be new tools that you didn't consider. So I'm going to talk a little bit about workflow practices, how to organize your project, then a little bit about coding practices, a little bit about version control, and then about dynamic documents. Okay, so what is a workflow? A workflow refers to any kind of combination of data, code, organization, and documentation. So this really covers a big part of what you do, until you go and write your paper up. So a few things that you should keep in mind when you work with data and when thinking about the workflow that you have. Ideally, for each project, you should keep everything in one folder or one working directory. Ideally, you should be using relative paths. So the idea of a relative path is that you set up a working directory or a folder that is kind of your home base for that project. And then when you refer to different files, let's say, to the data or to a different script, what you use is a relative path. So you're saying relative to the working directory, where exactly is that data or that file? And the advantages of using a relative path is that in principle, you can take this code and move it on a different computer, and it will still work as long as you have that folder or working directory. So once you set up the working directory, everything else should work fine, and it should help with, reproducibility and with sharing your code with other people. Ideally, you should organize your folder in a way that it's easy for other people to understand. And I know this is getting, harder the bigger the project, but try to have a standardized way to organize your work and try to make it comprehensible for other people for when you have to share code. And then try to use scripts for everything you do. So, don't do things in Excel, don't copy and paste data, don't change the original data and use the same name. Try to have a script for everything, and that will help with reproducibility, because in principle, it should be possible for me to download the original data, to use your code and get exactly the same results at the end. So that's kind of the ideal for reproducible workflow. And again, some of these are kind of basic things. Do not modify the raw data. So ideally, you should have a place where you have the raw data. You should say what version of the data it is, when you got it, and do not modify that. So that should be the starting point for your code. And in principle, if you have that data in the code, you should be able to replicate everything you do. Another small thing, do not use space in the names of these files and folders, because they don't work on all operating systems. Back up your stuff regularly. So GitHub actually is quite good for that, and I'll talk a little more about it, but you can use Dropbox or whatever your institution has to back up your work, as long as you're allowed to do that. Another important idea is this idea of a random seed. So if you have any type of process that is random, so for example, if you sample cases, or if you do some statistical models that have some random starts, it's important to set a random seed at the beginning, and that will make it possible for other people to replicate your work. So let's say, you want to sample 20 people and do a graph about how they change in time, just to visualize this. Every time you sample, or if someone else runs your code, they will sample other 20 people. And by setting the same random seed, you're actually making sure that everyone will select the same 20 people and will get exactly the same graph and analysis later on. So at the beginning of the project, if you have any kind of sampling or random start, you should have a random seed set, so everyone that runs your code gets the same results. So if you use R and RStudio, you should consider using R projects. So R project is just a way in which you can make a folder or a working directory in which you keep everything for that particular folder. And it has some advantages. It sets up the working directory for you. So you can use relative paths. It's relatively easier to share working R project, and then it's integrated with other things. So it's integrated with version control. So if you want to use Git, for example, it's much easier to do it like that. You can also use other packages like Renv. So Renv is a package that allows you to install other packages in your working directory. So basically each project has its own packages and its own version of R. And again, this makes it easier to share and to replicate your findings. So instead of having, some packages that get updated on your computer, and then, the code that you had a year ago doesn't work in the same way anymore. In this way, you have kind of a safe space where your code and the packages just are kept there. And then every time you want to rerun it, you'll get exactly the same results. So this is an example of a possible structure for your folder. Again, you don't have to use this. I'm just asking you to kind of think about how you organize your folder. So here, this is just the command in R to create a folder, and the dot represents the working directory. So this is the kind of the base of your work for that project. So first I create a folder called data, and then a subfolder called raw, and then one clean. So I'll put the raw data in the raw folder, and then any clean data I create, I'll put in the clean data set. And then an output folder, and again, I have normally separately figures and tables, but you can, depending on how many you have, you can have other subfolders as well, or have none. Then if you have any documentation, you can have a special folder for that. If you have a paper or report, you can put that there. And if you have a script or multiple scripts, you can put them again in a different folder. So if you look at the structure for a project that I would use, it will look something like this. So it would have a folder for the paper, a folder for the outputs for figures and tables, a folder for documentation, for data, folder for scripts. This is a README file, so you can use this to give information about the project, and I'm going to show you a little more about that a little later on. And this is the R project file. So this is a file that is created automatically when you created the R project. And again, this kind of it also has a kind of a version control. It says the working directory and so on. So you don't really care a lot about it. This is just created automatically. Another important thing is to share as much information as possible about the system that you're using to create some results. So ideally in the README file, you should have information about the software that you use. So for example, in R, if you write session info, it will give you all this information. So it will tell you the version of R, the platform, it will tell you the language, the packages that you use, and so on. And you can include this in the README file. So if someone wants to directly replicate your work, they know, okay, oh, so you used version 4.0.5 of R, and you had, text reg of 0.1.5. So in principle, they could make sure they have exactly the same version of R and the packages to enable them to replicate your work. Again, this is relatively easy to do and to include in the README file. I mentioned the RENV package before. So if you're like me and are working on lots of different projects, and the project might take a long time, so a reviewer might come to you after 1 year or 2 years and ask you to redo a graph or redo a model. By that time, there's a different version of R, there's a different version of all the packages that you used. So sometimes it might not be possible to actually get exactly the same results you had when you initially submitted that paper. So one solution to this is actually to have each project have their own packages with their own version of R and their own version of the package. So when I go back to a project, I can directly replicate everything I've done. I can go back in time and have version of 3.6 of R, older version of the packages to make sure that I have the same results. And RENV is a package that helps you with that. And again, it's kind of implemented with RStudio projects to automatically start it up if you want. And then you install packages and they will live together with your code and everything else to make it more kind of replicable. Another useful package is called package version. And this allows you to run older versions of particular packages. Again, it's useful if you want to replicate what somebody else did. But again, if you want to do this, then you need to know what version of the package they use. So that's why it's useful to share the session history. Another useful package is called checkpoint. And this is useful if you want to kind of go back in time at a particular point in time to get the version of the packages at that point in time. You can use the checkpoint package. When you write code, also, there are a couple of important things. So one is you should try to have consistent coding practices. So the way you write code, so for example, how many comments you include, the spacing and the new lines and everything, all of this is regarded as the style of your writing of code. And ideally, you should be consistent in how you do that. And ideally, you should be consistent even within your organization or within your research group. So the idea would be that if you look at the code written by someone else, you can understand what they've done there. And it's easier to understand. And there are some recommendations for this. So if you go out to this link, for example, it will have some principles that they use. And with tidyverse, there's one created by Google that says, okay, this is the style that we have at Google to use R. This is how we write our code at Google. So you can look at that and kind of get some inspiration. And they're kind of small things like, okay, do you need a space after the comma? Do you use equal or the arrow in order to allocate or to create a new object? All of these should ideally be standardized, so it just makes it easier for you to understand what you've done in the past and for other people to understand what you've done as well. Ideally, scripts should be self-contained. So for example, if you have a larger project, you might have multiple scripts, one to maybe clean the data, one to analyze the data, one to write a report, for example. So all of these should be independent. So for example, the cleaning of the data, you should be able to run it all. You should import some raw data, and at the end, you should save some clean data. Then the next script, it should be just importing the clean data, and it should be able to run on its own and do all the analysis. So ideally, that way, if there's a bug somewhere, it's easier to find, and you can just look at the script separately to understand what they do. Ideally, you should have tests in your code. So if you, again, want to replicate in the future what you've done, you could have some tests. So for example, to say, check if this data set has the number of cases I expect. So you can have a little check in your code, and if that doesn't work, it could give you an error to tell you, oh, the data has changed or something has changed because I don't get the same results. And this becomes more important as you have larger, a bigger amount of code, then you might get more and more issues or bugs. So it's good to have tests to make sure you don't have, if you can't catch the bugs early on. Probably you have heard this before, or you kind of have an intuition that it's good to comment your code, although it's hard when you're actually writing code, it's hard and annoying. But I haven't heard anyone ever complain there's too much code too much comments in somebody's code. Again, you in the future or your colleagues will appreciate all the information you can offer them in the code to make it easier to understand. Again, I mentioned it before, try to separate different stages. If you have a complex project, different, for example, data cleaning, analysis, have different scripts to make it easier to understand. Another thing that is kind of small but quite important, you should try to make the objects that you use and the files that you save easy to understand. So ideally, the names should be informative, and it should be easy to understand what they mean. So this could be the names of data sets, could be the names of variables, could be the names of functions. All of them, ideally, you should spend maybe a little while to make sure that this is something you understand, and it's not, fun 1, fun 2, fun 20. It should be something that is easy to comprehend if you're new to the project. An important thing is also to go back through your code and clean it up. So to delete code that is not useful anymore, or objects that you don't use, files that are not useful anymore, just again to make the code easier for you to understand in the future. And ideally, when you create data, when you create new variables, these should be labeled. And if they're not labeled, you should have some kind of documentation or dictionary so other people can understand what the data represents. Okay, so a little bit about version control. So I think most of us have went through this where we don't have clear naming conventions, and we work with different people, and then the names of files start to look very strange, and it's unclear who did what at what point in time. So this comic is a nice example of that, but yeah, I think most of us have suffered through this. And ideally, to solve this, we should have some standards for naming documents, but also a more systematic approach is to have a version control system. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about. So this was initially developed for software programmers. And the idea is to kind of keep track of all the code that is out there to make sure there are no conflicts and to be able to track the different stages of development. And really, this has become very popular and very efficient and is slowly being used more and more also for scientific work and in the social sciences as well. So what this does is basically keeps track of a very detailed track of all the changes that happen to the code and also could be the data. And it's very useful when you work with other people as well, because it has systems for reviewing and giving feedback and going back in time to check if if the bug appears, to go back and have the original code again and so on. So one of the most popular programs for this is called Git. So I'm going to just give you a minute to read this comic. Okay, so as the comic highlights, actually Git can be very complex, quite complicated, but ideally, actually to work with it, you don't really need to know a lot of things. You only need to know a few basic concepts about how it works, and then it should be enough to get you started and being able to use it. So a few of the main concepts are, one is a repository. So this is like the working directory or the project in which you'll be working. So Git and GitHub is also organized like that. So you can have a folder that is a repository, and that includes all the files that are associated with that project. When you want to add something to Git, so Git remembers that you have done something, you add it to a staging area. So you just say that, okay, I want to save this, and then you commit it. So every time when you commit a change, so let's say you create a new file or you modify an existing file, you have to have a little message where you say what you have done. So for example, you say, I created a new script, or I created a new model that does this. And then after you committed, Git will remember that point in time. So it will know all the code before and until that point. And if you want to travel at any point before, it's easy to do that with Git. So it keeps track of all the changes that have happened at every time you did a commit. Again, this is a funny little comic about commits. So these are very useful because they have a history of everything that you have done with the code, although it can be kind of annoying to do them after a while as well. So you need to find kind of a sweet spot. You don't want to do them every 5 minutes, but you don't want to forget to do them, because then you might not save all the work that you have done. Okay, so ideally, from time to time, you should, once you finish a stage of writing your code, you should commit it and write a little message saying what you have done in that stage. So what you see here, this main line is actually called the main branch. So this is where you have the code. And an interesting thing that you have with Git is that you can have different branches. So here what you see is actually a little branch. And this is a way in which you can actually have a safe environment to check your code. So imagine you want to do something new. Let's say you have a package and you want to introduce a new feature to that package. Well, you can have a little safe space where you play around, you modify your function or your code. Then you can actually ask for feedback from someone, so you can send it for review. And then once everyone is happy with the code, it can be merged back with the main branch. This is one of the reasons why Git is very popular for software development, because you can actually have these safe environments for testing code, and code can be reviewed, and then it can be merged with the main branch. So for example, if you are Amazon or Facebook and you want to change your website, you don't want to fiddle around with your programs. You want to make sure they work and only then introduce them in development. So having something like a branch is make sure that you're not destroying your main website or your main product while still being able to experiment and introduce new features. So Git, in principle, it's a software you install on your computer and you can use it locally. But there's also a website called GitHub, which is a little bit like a server where you can back up your things. So if you want to use GitHub, you can simply make an account and link GitHub with your local Git. And then you can use GitHub as a backup and also as a way to collaborate with other people. So then you can do something called push. So when you push your code from your computer, it goes to GitHub. So basically in GitHub, it will make an update and it will include all the changes that you have on your local computer. So it will be updated to include all the commits you have locally. If you want to get the latest version of the software that is on GitHub, you can do a pull. So when you do a pull, you download all the latest version of the code. So this is very useful when you collaborate with other people. Let's say overnight, someone from the other side of the world did some changes to your code. When you start working, you can pull it, and then you have the latest version of the code, then you can continue working. You can also do things like fork or clone, and that means that you can create a copy of what other people have done. So for example, you can download all the data from Johns Hopkins because the repository is free, online, and open, and you can just make a copy of that. Or there are books that are written in R, and they're on GitHub, and you can create a copy of that book on your own computer by just forking the Git repository. You can also contribute to projects. So if you want to be part of a software project, you can change code, and then you can do something called a pull request, where you're asking whoever owns the project to check your code, and if they're happy with it, they can introduce it in production. So again, this is a useful tool to contribute and work with other people on software. So a few strengths of using something like version control. Well, you can jump back in time to any previous commit. So if you've done a mistake or you want to go at a particular point in time, you can do that. It can also allow you to selectively undo. So if you want to undo only parts of your code, you can also do that. It has a nice way to show all the differences in your code between different versions. And like I said before, it has this branching system where you have safe environments to experiment with new code. It's, like I said, it's very useful for collaboration. So it's often used when you have big projects, big teams, and you want to work with other people on complex code. But also it's a useful tool as a backup, even if you work on your own. And again, it's very useful because actually you can decide what files you want to share. So if you want to share the code, but not the data, you can do that. If you want to make it public or private, you can do that if you have the pro account. So it's very flexible, both for you as an individual and working as part of a team. I mentioned a few times before that you can link it with other services like Zenodo to get a DOI, so other people can cite your code. And again, that would be a motivation for you to share your code. Okay, so we're almost at the end, and then we'll take some questions and do the practical part. So the last thing I want to discuss are dynamic documents. So dynamic documents are a way in which you can combine code that is readable by software like R or Python, and then text that is readable by individuals. And this comes from an idea called literate programming, where the idea is that instead of just writing code for the computer and text for individuals, you want to combine the two and have something that makes sense for humans, but also can run as code. And this is a very powerful concept, and I'm going to show you that you can actually do lots of things using literate programming. So one of the advantages of this is that you can have everything within documents that are with code. So you can actually reproduce everything that you do. You don't need to copy and paste tables, to format tables by hand, and so on. Everything is done using code, and everything can be reproduced by someone else. It's also better suited to document work. So you can actually use it like a lab notebook where you show the code, show the results, show the interpretation. So it's a way for you to think through your code analysis, data cleaning, or whatever you're doing. It's a very useful way to share it with other people so they understand all the steps that you're following. Probably there are two tools that are the most popular for this. One is Jupyter Notebooks, and this is especially popular with data scientists. And then the other one is R Markdown, which is very popular with R users. That being said, actually, both in Jupyter Notebooks and R Markdown, you can run code from different software. So you can run R or Python or Stan, both in a Jupyter Notebook and in a R Markdown. Both of them allow actually for you to have multiple languages in the same document. And again, this offers you lots of flexibility about how to run things and the documents you want to create. So I talked a lot about programming, and the reason why I did this is that this is becoming more and more important in the social sciences as time passes. So I really think this quote is important from Christensen and all. So every generation of future quantitative social science researchers will need to learn more programming, and when they do so, it makes sense to adopt the best practices of computer programmers and data scientists. So a lot of some of the things I mentioned are pretty basic, and some might be new to you, but I would urge you to consider this idea of workflows and how you organize your work with data, because as time passes, this becomes more and more important, both for you and for sharing your work with other people. Okay, so let's do a short recap. So we started with the problems. So we talked a little bit about publication bias and the file drawer problem. And then we talked about kind of peak hacking and how researchers might be selective in the kind of results they present. And then we talked about different solutions. So things like meta-analysis, systematic sensitivity analysis. And then we talked about standards for reporting and other things like what else did we cover? Data sharing, for example. And then we finished with practices. So I explained a little bit about version control and dynamic documents, and then a little bit about how you can organize your workflow with data. Okay, so I know we covered a lot, from very general to very specific, but hopefully this will be a starting point for you to think about some of these concepts. So if you want to learn more, so a big part of, especially the first part of the presentation, is based on this book, Transparent and Reproducible Social Science Research. I highly recommend it. Then if you're interested in R and R Markdown, these two books are useful. Again, actually, you can find some of these online for free. R Markdown for sure. I think this one is available on GitHub if you want to look at it. So I think these would be places where you can go to learn more. Then if you want to kind of learn a little more about how to organize your GitHub repository, you can have a look at these links. There are different ways people have gone about organizing their work. Again, there's no perfect way to do it. Just find something that makes sense to you and try to be consistent. And before we go to the break and the practical part, I have this final quote from Feynman. So the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. So you have to be very careful about that. After you've not fooled yourself, it's easy not to fool other scientists. Okay, so we're all kind of struggling to improve our practices, to make things slightly better. And hopefully this presentation helped you to get in that direction and motivated you that this is important. So what I'm going to do is stop now for Q&A, then maybe we'll take a 10 minutes break, and then there's a practical part. So you should have received, or on the website, there's a practical sheet. And what I'll do after the break is show you basically a few things with version control and dynamic documents, so you can use it as a reference in the future. So any questions before we take the break?
Hey, Alex, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great presentation, thank you. I was just curious, when you show the session info, I've seen it before. I've never used it, but I saw that you had like some packages that like are not among, like you had listed some packages that are not the packages that are preloaded, right, in R when you open. So I was just wondering, do you do that after you run all your code? You print that and you put with your what do you call, the README file?
Yeah. So yeah, you should, after you load all the packages that you are going to use, and ideally after you run all your code, you can run this, and that should include all the information you need. There are packages like Renv, for example. It's quite nice because they actually help you remember what packages you use as well. So it has some tools to clean up, because sometimes you might load packages you don't use and so on. So there are some tools to help with that. But I think that's a good point. You should run this after you run all your code. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. And good to see you. Other questions? Let's see. So there's a question about APOR standards. Any thoughts on how applicable they are to EMA? I actually am not sure what EMA studies are. Sorry, Jamie, can you tell me what that is? EMA? Yeah, okay. I actually don't know anything about that. So I'm not sure how. So I'm okay. Yeah. So it's like experiential surveys where you have multiple data collections within the day. So you might have lots of data collected. Yeah, I actually don't think it's that different. I mean, I imagine you might have something like a computational issue if you have huge amount of data and you want to share it. My recommendation for that is basically to just have different versions of the data that you share. So you can say, okay, I'm going to stop data collection at this point, and I'm going to use this data, let's say, for a paper, and you can share this. This is version 1.0. It includes all this data from 200 individuals for this 200 days. And then if you update the data, then you have a new version of the data, which is version 2.0. And one way to deal with this is when you explain what analysis you have done. You just say, okay, I used version 1.0 of this data that included this information over this period and these individuals. So I think if you combine kind of version history for the data that you use with keeping track of it in your documentation, that should solve it. I'm not sure if you have computational issues. So if the data is very large, what you can do is also subsample it. So let's imagine that you do that, and then at the same time, you have digital trace data that follows everything that these individuals do on their phone. So that data can become very large, very fast. And then you might first have some restrictions about who can access the data because it could be sensitive. And then you could subsample, for example, and have it only on particular days or particular individuals to deal with this issue that the data is too large. And then I imagine doing like synthetic data that could be quite complicated as well. So that if you want to do that, I assume you need to look into it, because you have all these dependencies in time and between individuals. But those would be the things I would consider: version control for the data and making very clear what data I use. And if the data is very large, subsample, subsample based on either individuals or points in time, depending on how you think the users will use the data. Okay, thank you. Okay.